Trofian na Gaelic. sé jólaige an een film trofian na Gaelige in de nering a han den Emily agus ha stage ik e collage na Trianage an den balle klie agus gojara héchacking tór jongsacha van een opes ha vigianu kohéeltje die fémelach een teichte waarach aan de film boekie. We're delighted this afternoon to welcome Assistant Professor Emily Barnes, who's with us this afternoon to talk about how we understand and support dyslexia in Gaelic medium education. Emily works within Irish Immersion Education and is based at Trinity College Dublin. And there's a lot that we can learn from the work that Emily's been involved in the area of additional support needs and immersion education. Fáilte Emily, welcome this afternoon. It's really lovely to have you with us. Mór an tainc Jara.
Mór an tainc Anne, agus mór an tainc son an Eric. And as Anne mentioned there, I'm based in Trinity College Dublin. And I'm just going to share my slides with you now. So today we'll be speaking about understanding and supporting dyslexia in Gaelic medium education. And this is where I'm based in Trinity College Dublin, where I run the MEd san Oideachas Slán Gaeilge agus Gaeltachta, where the MEd in Irish medium and Gaeltachta education, which is, I think, similar to the MEd in Gaelic education in Salmore Ostig. And if any of you are ever in Dublin, you are more than welcome to visit us. We'd be delighted to have you visit the School of Education and hear more about your work and your practice, and also to share a little bit of ours. So the talk today is going to be structured in 3 sections, and in the first section I'll be talking about dyslexia and what we know about dyslexia from research, and a little bit about what research cannot tell us yet about dyslexia. And I'll touch briefly on the Gaelic orthography or writing system. Then I'm going to move on to identifying dyslexia in Gaelic medium and Irish medium contexts, where I speak a little bit about foregrounding language background and experience and some of the challenges that we share, including a lack of assessment materials and how we can try and get around that as best we can. And finally, I'll speak a little bit about supporting dyslexia in Gaelic medium education, really focusing on attitudes and as well what we know about what works based on the research. Throughout the talk then, I'll talk a little bit about potential research projects or areas of research that you might be interested in. And I should say from the outset that I think that practitioner research is hugely important, particularly in a minority language background. Given how little is done in each of our languages and contexts, any bit of research that adds to the knowledge base or adds tools is massively important. So I commend you for being here today and look forward to hearing in the future about your research. So first of all, I'm going to just start by describing dyslexia, and just note that the first few slides here are going to be quite general in nature, and towards the end of this section I'll be looking at Gaelic and the Irish medium context more specifically. So dyslexia can be described at multiple different levels, at the behavioural level, the cognitive level, the neurobiological and genetic level, as well as the environmental level. And I'm just going to touch on areas within each of these levels that are useful for identification and support in the classroom. At the behavioural level, what you might see is often a child who has difficulty with reading accuracy or maybe automatizing their reading skills. So often you might see a child who's still decoding words when many of their peers are kind of recognizing sight words, or children who are having difficulty with reading fluency or comprehension. In the latter years in primary school, you might have children who are able to write up an essay quite nicely, but there might be no punctuation, or there might be very phonetic spelling and so on. So there are various different characteristics there in terms of literacy. But beyond literacy, then there's also challenges for students with dyslexia with regard to, say, inhibitory control, which is being able to block out distractions. So maybe your friend putting their hand up in front of you, or talking. It's harder for children with dyslexia to drown that out and really focus on what they want to focus on. And auditory memory is another aspect of dyslexia. So that's can show itself in maybe someone having difficulty remembering instructions that have more than one step, or memorizing nursery rhymes, or recalling a word that you've just taught them. And interestingly, this study here by Lonergan, they look at children with dyslexia, and then with dyslexia and co-occurring ADHD, because they do occur together. But these findings are also just for children with dyslexia. So I think it's quite an interesting study there. And dyslexia also is associated with dyscalculia. So children with dyslexia are twice as likely to have dyscalculia. And it's really just the basic math skills that are affected. So it doesn't mean that the child will have any difficulty with more abstract or advanced maths at all. It might even be an area of strength for them. It's just the more basic skills of, for example, number sense, which is to do with understanding quantities, numerical relationships, as well as the memorization of basic maths facts. So maybe your multiplication tables, if you memorize them or get children to memorize them, as well as fluent and accurate calculations. And this is just because, or we think it's because, learning to read and learning basic math skills requires the same type of underlying skills. And I'll speak a little bit about them in the next slide. So if you want to learn to read the word UL, say as a sight word, you need to have the phonological code, or the spoken word UL, as well as the written or orthographic code UPHAL, as well as the meaning code, so that knowing that it's an apple, it refers to an apple that's red or green, and so on, and integrate them into memory. So that's the task with knowing a written word, which is very similar to the task of understanding and knowing numbers. So, for example, we have the phonological or spoken word ceithid for 4, as well as the written code, the symbol 4, and then the meaning, the quantity of having 4 things. So they're very similar in that way, and the thought is, or the reasoning is, that similar skills underlie both maths and early literacy, and that's why they're both similarly affected. At the cognitive level, you might have heard about the phonological deficit hypothesis. It has been for many years a prevailing hypothesis with regard to dyslexia and why dyslexia occurs. And phonological awareness is just the explicit awareness of and the ability to manipulate sounds. And you test it with these little tasks like the following. So do coat and dog start with the same sound? And say the word table, and now say the word table without the t. But in more recent times, researchers have been investigating whether dyslexia is not much more varied than originally thought, with multiple possible causes rather than just a phonological deficit. And I'm sorry to be using deficit-based language here, but that's just the name of this concept. And this is based on evidence that some students do have a phonological deficit, but some do not. And trying to account for that, as well as trying to account for co-occurring challenges that people face, like with regard to memory and regard to concentration and distractibility. So I think that dyslexia research is an interesting place, and it's looking more like there are multiple possible ways to have dyslexia or causes of dyslexia, and that we shouldn't really focus just on a phonological deficit. The implication for you as educators is that really assessment for dyslexia should focus on art rather than just phonological. Although phonological awareness can be really useful in the first couple of years of schooling, but after that, after that, really focusing on reading and writing is the way to go, and particularly important that students aren't defined as dyslexic or not dyslexic due to the presence of a phonological deficit or not. At the genetic level, then, I think this is important because of how much more likely a child is to have dyslexia if their parent has it, which is 40 to 60% probability of having dyslexia. It's higher if other members of the family are dyslexic. And it's great if you know that a child has a family history of dyslexia, and if the parents or guardians are happy to discuss it, it's really helpful because you know that that likelihood is more is higher than it would be otherwise. So that's why it's important to know a little bit about the genetic level. So dyslexia is heritable and very heritable. And it's undoubtable, as I'm sure you know, that students with dyslexia have many different strengths. Some studies have shown that dyslexic students have particular strengths. So as a group, that students have strengths in, for example, creativity or visuospatial tasks. However, this is a little bit conspóideach, or there's different viewpoints on this, because a recent review of the literature has found that findings in this regard are inconsistent, and it's likely that students with dyslexia, that their strengths are just as individual as they are and not likely to be the same for everyone. So that's a little bit about what research does tell us and can tell us about dyslexia, and I just wanted to say a couple of words on what it can't tell us at the moment about dyslexia. The first thing, and something that's common to all fields of research, is that most studies on dyslexia focus on the differences between two groups. So say your dyslexic group and your non-dyslexic group. And that can tell us a lot about, at the group level, whether as a group students with dyslexia score better or worse on a given skill or trait. But it really doesn't tell us much about the individuals within that group. And the implication for us as educators is that students with dyslexia are all different. They're not necessarily going to align with all of the findings that I've maybe pointed to here. And they're not going to align with every kind of observational checklist or anything. Everyone's quite different in their strengths and in the areas that they have challenges with. Another limitation of the field of literacy research and dyslexia has been the overwhelming focus on English, the English language and English language speakers. So David Sher says here, nearly 20 years ago, but still relevant, the idiosyncrasies of English, an exceptional, indeed outlier orthography in terms of spelling to sound correspondence, have shaped a contemporary reading science preoccupied with distinctly narrow Anglo-centric research issues that have only limited significance for a universal science of reading. So for us, our contexts differ quite a bit from the English monolingual speakers context. So for a start, the children that we're working with are bilingual. They have two languages, and often they have two orthographic writing systems as well to deal with. They're also in a minority language context, which means that they may not have the same amount of exposure as a majority language speaker would have to their single language. And it also means that we have differing resources available to us as educators. They're also learning to read in a very different orthography. So they're learning to read in a Celtic orthography that has been studied considerably less than English. So all of those things are important because it means that what we find in the research, we have to be a little bit critical and skeptical of applying it to our own contexts kind of wholesale. There is research existing on literacy development and Gaelic medium education. Similarly to the Irish context, thankfully it shows that there's no disadvantages to Gaelic medium students in comparison to their English medium peers, and there are some advantages. So there's research there by Scottish researchers, and more of this is needed in both of our contexts. So both with regard to literacy development as well as dyslexia and how that develops in our context, and also with regard to what works in terms of supporting students with dyslexia. Excuse my little error there in Gaelic. I want you to think for a second about orthographic depth, and I'll come to what that means in just a second. But first of all, I'll ask you how you would spell the sound E if you were to write it down in English. And you're going to have lots of different choices. So you might spell it EY or E or EE or EA, and you won't really have, there's no rules to tell you when to do that really. And similarly with, say, if you had the string of letters OUGH, how would you pronounce that string of letters? So it might be oo as in through, or the O as in though, off as in cough, uff as in tough, or aw as in thought. That's in my variety of English. And this concept maps very nicely orthographic depth. So if you think about the way that English has many ways to spell a given sound and many ways to pronounce a given string of letters, that means that in terms of orthography or writing system, English is a deep orthography. Some people say deep, some people say opaque. They both mean the same thing. And we can contrast this then with Spanish, which is a shallow orthography, where usually one letter corresponds to one sound. Italian is similar, so is Finnish. Orthographic depth is a really important variable in literacy development because children learning to read in shallow orthographies learn to read much faster than they do in deeper orthographies. And dyslexia also looks different in each case as well. So for our deep orthographies, we know that children typically their accuracy is affected, so they usually make spelling errors, reading errors, and fluency is also affected, so they won't be as fluent as their peers often. And in shallow orthographies, usually kids are pretty accurate in terms of their reading. They don't tend to make so many errors. It's fluency that's affected more than anything else. And, oh, excuse me. In the Gaelic orthography, similarly to Irish, it has the advantage of being much more regular and predictable than English. This is a massive advantage for students, and it's a real selling point, I think, for our languages as well, and reading in our languages. But the key is knowing the rules that make up that kind of make Gaelic regular. So in both of our languages, the broad consonants are a really important part.
Now, Emily,
Apologies,
I'm
I
not
think
sure
that.
if there was a wee delay there. I think we just lost probably about 10 seconds or so.
Okay, perfect. I might start from
More
this
than
slide
fine.
again.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So Gaelic, like Irish, has the advantage of being very regular and consistent, much more so than English, which is a real advantage for our students if they're aware of the letter to sound rules. And what's really important in both of our languages is this distinction between slender and broad consonants. So just in this example here, we have the word zich. So we have our slender consonant z or j, and then we have this vowel here just telling us that this consonant is slender. Then we have our vowel, our O, which is spoken and also tells us that the CH is broad. But if children aren't aware of the reason for the vowel existing there, just to tell us that the consonant is slender, it's very difficult to understand the writing system. I think that this document by Thorlin Washington na Gaelic is really useful. It's a brilliant description of the sound system of Gaelic as well, if you're interested in that. And I'm sure you're much more knowledgeable about it than I am. But a very useful resource nonetheless. So then moving on to identifying dyslexia in our contexts, and particularly in your context, in the Gaelic medium context. And I just want to point out first the challenges that we both share. So these are usually, in most cases, lack of assessment materials, which includes normed assessments, screeners, and diagnostic assessments. So that's both for teachers, for teachers involved in special education, as well as for educational psychologists. There's also the issue of educational psychologists who are not fluent in Gaelic or who don't have a good understanding of bilingualism. And I'm sure that you have seen instances of either underdiagnosis or overdiagnosis in that context. And then there's the difficulty between distinguishing between a delay in a child's language proficiency development and a learning difference such as dyslexia. So while an English medium teacher can often put much more weight or much more confidence in a given screening tool or diagnostic tool, in the Gaelic medium and Irish medium contexts, we need to take a much more holistic approach and ethnographic approach into integrating more sources of evidence and pieces of evidence. And one way to do this is by the Riot approach, and I'll bet that it's quite similar to what you do already. But the first step is to review students' educational records to establish whether they need further investigation, and then to interview and speak with the student and their parents or guardians and establish what their language background is, their home language, any history of dyslexia if you can, and then to observe the students' behaviours over time, particularly in literacy areas as well as memory, concentration and maths, and then to do the testing. And the testing then is just it's just one more piece of evidence in your in this process. This Riot approach came from originally from speech and language therapy background, and just kind of adapted it here for the educational context, the classroom context. And if you're wondering what you should be thinking about when you're talking about language background and experience, Donaldson here has pointed out, says that we should consider the age at which the student started speaking each language, the languages that are spoken at home and by whom and in what proportions, and the nature and extent of the child's experience in each language in other contexts. So for example, in playgroup, in nursery, with family and friends or extracurricular activities and so on, and which language a child tends to speak most and whether it varies. You can see that maybe some of these items might be more useful or more relevant in the first couple of years in schooling, particularly to do with the nursery or playgroup. You'd think that the effects of that will have kind of dwindled by maybe the third year of schooling. But these are interesting and worthwhile aspects to take into account when you're considering a child's language background and experience. So then when you've looked at the language background, you're going to move on to observation and addressing dyslexia has an observational checklist for Gaelic, which is at the address there at the bottom of the screen. And it maps quite well onto what we know in the literature with regard to the characteristics of dyslexia in relation to literacy and memory and concentration and maths that we looked at a little bit earlier. I just wanted to point out here at this point that I'm at the moment developing a behavioural observation checklist for bilinguals in Irish medium education, which will be ready, I think, towards the summertime. Just working on the paper at the moment, and then I'll work on the kind of development part afterwards. But there would be potential projects, say in the next academic year, if people are interested in adapting it for the Gaelic medium context, or maybe gathering teachers' opinions on its utility, or maybe looking at how reliable and valid it is as a tool. So if you are interested, you're more than welcome to contact me in the summertime at the address there, barnesm@tcd.ie. And I think that it would be very adaptable for the Gaelic context and possibly for other contexts too. So then when we're talking about the literacy, when we're talking about literacy assessment, then I know that the landscape is changing based on my reading of these papers. But I'm not aware, you'll know better than I do whether or not you have normed assessments now, or whether they're very nearly there. I think that's what was on the cards a number of years ago. So maybe there's been progress made, or possibly not enough. But also in addition to that, then for the various sub-skills, I know that there are these there are assessments available either as from researchers such as Dr. Fiona Lyne here, or else from FISR Foeman and various phonics programs. But in any case, what you really should be looking at for literacy assessment is phonological awareness in the, and then really moving on to decoding, sight word reading, reading fluency, and reading comprehension as soon as it's age appropriate for the child. So another issue that we face is identifying whether a child might have a lack of exposure to the language, or if they might have a learning difference such as dyslexia. So just a couple of pieces of evidence that you can gather to distinguish between those two situations here. So the first way is to look at the discrepancy between the student and their peers with a similar language background. And to do that, you need to have a good idea of the student's language background, of course, and also to know a little bit about the effect of language proficiency on different reading skills. So this paper here by Esther Gava is very good. It outlines, and I know it's an older paper, but it's still very relevant, the findings of it. It outlines what the relationship is between reading proficiency, or between the L2 proficiency, second language proficiency, and various reading skills. It's really useful to know, because you can say then, okay, at this stage, in the first schooling, when a child's focusing on decoding, really language proficiency doesn't come into it that much, although maybe that kind of needs to be done with reference to the language, the literacy skill. Another aspect to take into account is the discrepancy between the student's language comprehension and reading comprehension. One way to do this is to do kind of a structured assessment with 4 images that the child would narrate a story on once you give them a few minutes to prepare, and then ask them to write a story based on similar pictures. And then as a teacher, you'd evaluate the story quality, so maybe the content of the story, maybe its structure, as well as linguistic factors like grammatical accuracy and vocabulary, breadth and depth, and so on. You'll see that Kondratiani and Butcher here have adapted the multilingual assessment instrument for Gaelic. I haven't looked deeply into that. I wanted to reference it here in case it's useful for anyone for their own research, but that might be an area or a tool which would be useful in this context. Another way, another piece of evidence to consider is co-occurring characteristics. So when you're thinking about items, particularly that relate to memory and concentration, that are known to be affected in dyslexia. So our inhibitory control or distractibility, as well as auditory memory, and also maths, basic math skills too. The student themselves and the guardian or parent will often give you really useful evidence about their experience of literacy and possibly family history, and whether they feel that it accurately represents them. And a final method of or way of gathering data is by dynamic assessment. Dynamic assessment is which you may well be very familiar with, a type of assessment which measures the ability to learn a given skill rather than measuring the skill itself, or measuring the knowledge that a student has themselves. So the typical way to do this is to test, teach, and retest. So say, for example, if you were teaching new phonics rules, you would test the children on these phonics rules. Then you would teach again, or maybe teach for the first time, the rules, and then you retest, and you're looking at whether a student has retained the rules, whether they're able to kind of use them to read words or read new words. And it's a useful one which can kind of take language proficiency out of the question a little bit, or put it to the side, because you're looking at learnability really rather than their knowledge. And before I go and discuss this paper, I have it on a slide here because I think it's a really interesting paper and it highlights the value of dynamic assessment. But I am for a second saying that anyone should do this because everyone has enough to do rather than kind of teaching a novel or pretend orthography or writing system. But it's just a really interesting paper and highlights kind of the value of dynamic assessment. So what Elbro and colleagues did here was that they were working with a group of Danish second language learners, and the Danish writing system or orthography is very similar to English. It's really complex and really unpredictable. So they had this group of second language learners and they thought the majority were dyslexic. So they thought 88% were probably dyslexic based on their Danish reading tests. So then what they did was they did some dynamic assessment using this novel orthography. So they taught the participants that this symbol here equated to s, this one equated to m, and this one equated to o. And then they asked them to read words that were based on these letters. And based on this assessment, they classified 48% as dyslexic compared to when they were using the Danish reading test. They classified much more as dyslexic. So this is just to say that dynamic assessment can be really valuable in showing the potential to learn a given skill rather than the given skill or what a student has learned already. So that's our Riot approach. In a way, I think that student or teacher judgment is much more important in the Irish and Gaelic medium context than it is for our English medium peers, and that does put an extra onus and an extra workload really on the Gaelic medium or Irish medium teacher, because you don't have the objective tools that English medium peers have to work with, and really it needs a more holistic approach. So this is another reason why dyslexia research and research related to identifying dyslexia is really valuable and would be really valuable for Gaelic. So moving on then to supporting dyslexia in the Gaelic medium education context. I think that when we're talking about support for dyslexia, we can talk about attitudes or knowledge or strategies or resources. And I'm going to focus in really on attitudes and knowledge today, and what we know from research. And if you're interested more in strategies and resources, take a look at this report by Education Scotland and Dr. Fiona Lyne, Improving Practice in Gaelic Education, which is available at that link there. But good attitudes are really the frame or the basis of good support for dyslexia. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here because you're all here because you're more than aware of the potential that students with dyslexia have, which is a great thing because we know that positive teacher attitudes predict better literacy outcomes for students. It's really important then to give students the opportunity to be successful in reading, and the opportunity to have moments of success during the day, especially because we know that students with dyslexia typically have higher levels of anxiety and lower self-esteem than their peers. And I think it's really important to explain to not only students with dyslexia but the whole class that literacy isn't a measure of intelligence. It's not a measure of IQ at all. All it is just a way to get information and to convey information. And it's useful, of course, but it can be circumvented with things as simple as listening to podcasts or watching films. It's just one way to gather information. And I think it's interesting to think about literacy as in contrast with spoken language, which is something natural that is learned and that has occurred in humans. Literacy is man-made. It came about much later than oral language did, and it's kind of dyslexia is really a man-made a man-made thing also, because it just comes about as a result of literacy. But all literacy is just a way to get information and convey information. There's nothing special about it in terms of telling us about someone's intelligence. As an aside, I do think I often, when I hear people or see people criticizing someone's the presentation of their work or spelling errors and so on, I think that it's, that it really isn't a representation of anything to do with the person's ability, and that it's not kind of it's not a good critique of anyone's work. I think if things are to be critiqued, it should be ideas and someone's content, rather than anything to do with the presentation. But I think that also that classrooms and schools and teachers have come a long way since maybe when we were in school, or when I was in school, and people do look more at content, more at ideas now. But I wanted to move on to the core skills of literacy, and particularly the constrained skills, the early skills in literacy. So we know that phonemic awareness interventions and structured phonics programs are effective, particularly for younger readers, and particularly when letters are included. I found in the Irish context that certain phonemic skills transferred readily across languages. So deletion, phoneme deletion, so table without the t, or blending phonemes together, or segmenting a word, transferred readily across languages, whereas the skill of differentiating between different phonemes was language specific in Irish speaking students. So for example, knowing that Doris and Zoch start with different sounds, or Kiecht and He, is a language specific skill. I found as well in Irish speaking students that omitting vowels that marked the consonant quality, so say the E from Zoch here, or I won't give another example because it'll just be from Irish, and I'm not sure if it carries across, but that was the most common spelling error for Irish speaking students in the third year of schooling, which would be about 8 to 9. And Dr. Fiona Lyon has developed phonological awareness assessments and has written lots about Gaelic phonological awareness, if you're further interested in that area. Morphological awareness is another real area of promise, I think, particularly for Irish and Gaelic. Morphological awareness is basically the awareness of and ability to break down or manipulate the smallest units of meaning in a word. So say, for example, I have this word "neo-harstil" here, and we have the prefix "neov", the base noun "harsht", which I presume is from "harstis" or "harde", "harste", a little bit different in Irish, "carzas" and "carza", and then we have the suffix "e", which tells us it's an adjective. So focusing on these units of meaning for dyslexic students. And I think, though we haven't got the research to say that it is, I think it could be more important in Irish and Gaelic due to, for example, lenition, so awo, and the noun cases, so te and banate, which change the form of a verb, but they do so within a pattern. So I think that morphological awareness is a real area of promise for dyslexia in our contexts. I do think that there's going to be a lot of language-specific instruction, of course, that's needed in morphological awareness, because English is quite simple morphologically, and then our languages are much more complex. And just a little note, I thought about kind of linking assessment to support. You can have a look at, for example, in spelling, have a look at the type of errors that are made by the student. So if you think about this is a real error that a student made. So instead of dove, which is the word for black in Irish, this student had that dal. So you can see here that the sounds aren't well represented. So I might think here, if this is a pattern, I might think, okay, this person might need a little bit more phonological awareness. The second example, dove, we have MH being swapped out for BH, and that's makes phonological sense in Irish. It can be done. It's just not the case for this word dove, which has the BH. So I can tell that this person has good phonological awareness, and maybe it's orthographic awareness, or just familiarity with the word that needs some support. And another pattern of errors would be morphological errors. So if you're consistently seeing someone leaving out Lanishan or the Shevu, so for example, this should be Sean instead of Sean. That would be an example of morphological, where someone might need just morphological awareness support. Okay, and then moving on to reading fluency and comprehension. So our higher order reading skills. One possibly controversial method of increasing reading fluency is repeated reading. So this is just rereading a short text until a target reading rate is achieved. So just usually it's words per minute, and it's more effective when feedback is provided and when there's a given goal, kind of a stated goal. As you can imagine, this doesn't suit all students. So for some, they might kind of relish the challenge of being timed, or having to try and get their time down. And for others, it's just frustrating or dull. So it really depends on the student's personality. And there's other options that you're familiar with, maybe readers theatre, but there isn't the same amount of peer-reviewed research about readers theatre. So I'm just kind of focusing on things that are in the literature come up as effective. Though readers theatre does have a lot, there's a lot of research on reading engagement and readers theatre, so it's definitely a very worthwhile practice, just in the context of reading fluency I'm talking about here. Then with regard to reading comprehension, we know that dyslexic students don't struggle typically with oral language comprehension unless they have a co-occurring language impairment. So if a student has a reading comprehension difficulty, it's typically to do with the decoding and the reading fluency. So maybe they're not decoding the words accurately, or maybe the reading is slow, so that when they're trying to keep the sentence in working memory, it's just too long from the start of the sentence to the end of the sentence for them to keep it in their memory. One thing that's sometimes missing in immersion settings is reading comprehension strategies. And Jacqueline de Bruin, she works in a university in Dublin as well. She does lovely work, and I've cited her here because she found that immersion teachers in Irish medium setting were really focusing on the meaning of individual vocabulary items and making sure that children understood every single word in the text, rather than focusing in on teaching comprehension strategies. Whereas in English medium schools, they were kind of okay with people not understanding a word here and there. So really explicitly teaching comprehension strategies is recommended there. So we're talking about questioning, activating prior knowledge, summarizing and predicting. And though I've just said not to focus on just translating vocabulary, a strong oral vocabulary is really useful for students with dyslexia. So definitely in the language classroom, and when you're speaking and just during the course of the day, highlighting vocabulary is really useful too. And I just wanted to note, because I know some of you will be doing research, maybe in this year, maybe in the coming couple of years, potential for doing intervention studies in Gaelic medium education. And I'm going to talk a little bit about different designs which might suit a single class school or a 2-class school. So you might have a research question such as, how effective is a morphological awareness intervention in increasing Gaelic medium students' spelling skills? Or maybe it's a reader's theatre, maybe it's reading fluency. So it could be any of those things. If you have, say, for example, a 2-stream school, and you have an equivalent class near you that has kind of similar, I would say, demographics. So maybe it's a mixed school too, and maybe from a similar area, similar background. A cluster control trial is a good one to do. So this is where you have 2 groups in one group you have the experimental group, and say that might be your group as the researcher, and you're going to implement the morphological awareness training. And then the other group is the control, so they're doing traditional literacy instruction. And in both groups, you're testing morphological awareness and spelling beforehand, and then you're going to do your intervention, and then you're going to do your testing morphological awareness and spelling afterwards. The cluster control trial is nice, but it might not be available to everyone. So maybe you're in a rural school with a single class, and maybe there aren't any comparable schools nearby. If you just have one group and you want to do an intervention type study, one way to do it is a time series design. So you would test morphological awareness and spelling at multiple time points throughout the year. So maybe like September, December, March, and June. And between two of these time points, you're going to implement the morphological awareness intervention, and you're going to test skills immediately before and immediately after. And what you want to see is that whether morphological awareness and spelling, whether skills increase more between those two time points, immediately before and after the intervention, than at the other time points. What you're trying to rule out really there is that an improvement is happening to student skills just over time, just because they're getting older and have more access and more exposure to literacy. So that's just a brief note on research. I wanted to finish up now with a couple of slides on assistive technology, because often teachers are unsure about whether or when to introduce synthetic voices in the classroom. So that's like, you have the Katie voice, I think, from Thorlin. I wasn't able to access this because you need a public service email address, which I don't have, of course, but you will. But just with regard to when to introduce a synthetic voice, sometimes people think that it's going to negatively affect reading skills. I think that if a child is being prevented from accessing the curriculum by reading skill, then it can be really useful to introduce a synthetic voice then. So say they're doing their history reading, and really they're not maybe able to access the information because of the reading. So it's definitely worth introducing a synthetic voice at that point. And you can still provide lots of opportunities to practice literacy skills in the language classroom. But even within language lessons, research shows that synthetic voices or having recordings with reading comprehension can really benefit literacy skills. So you'll see that from Chang and Millet's reading program. I'm not going to go into that in detail for time reasons, but another advantage is that it can help children notice word pronunciation and to kind of mimic or copy word pronunciation. So that's another advantage of synthetic voices. And there's a decision to be made about how to introduce synthetic voices. So if you introduce them maybe in an unstructured way, there's the potential for the student to not want to engage, and maybe for them to kind of not use it. So what's recommended is having a trial period that you set out beforehand. Okay, we'll do this for 2 weeks. Let's see what happens, and set down kind of specific goals beforehand, and see what happens at the end of that 2-week period. Where resources allow, having training for the student and parent is fantastic if you can do that. And another recommendation here is to use technology in the classroom. So Wynne and colleagues there, that was a report in Ireland, they found that one of the big pitfalls is that you have teenagers in a classroom and they don't want to be the one to stand out and have a computer in front of them, or be using kind of earphones and so on. So if you're using technology, if it's part of the classroom setup anyway, it doesn't feel as big as a jump for people. Zabala, this paper is excellent if you're interested in assistive technology. She recommends considering the student, the environment, the tasks, and the tools. So pitfalls, for example, in the environment might be that there's no plug sockets available in the computer in the classroom, or that, for example, the students' charger's plugged in and everyone's tripping over it and that sort of thing. So thinking about all of those seemingly basic things, first of all, can prevent someone from giving up on their assistive technology. with regard to synthetic voices specifically, then, before a student starts out with a new voice, you should check that the speed is okay for them, so that it's not too slow to be frustrating or too fast that they don't understand it. And another aspect is that stopping and starting again can be really frustrating for people. So if you discuss new vocabulary or grammatical structures that might that can be really useful.
Sáiriste. Mór an tain game a lever sin díach sáiriste. That was absolutely superb. Good a míle Makov, I should say. Ba cho intineach. I wish I'd had this opportunity 20 years ago when I was starting out in Gaelic teaching. I think it was really so interesting and pretty vital, I think, that we can have access to these professional conversations with the likes of yourself. That was fascinating. Really, I'm kind of at a loss almost because I'm like, right, I now need to go off and look up all of your references and consider what our next steps could be. And definitely for our teacher associates at the centre, there are lots of opportunities for them as well as other classroom practitioners to engage with so many of your prompts and ideas there. That was phenomenal. Can I have a quick reminder for folk that are present in Bixuchama and Forum Luchi, Chushinas and chat na Baraya Eliana, Dorach minute chats the Hashin Bringing. I guess Kujach ha Forum Clary Aun or son Fistrach vo Elam Hitcherin Kujachas and chat Hashin Gamod or son cleanching wave, I guess na Rosh Richard or son of Ian Sass as as na adult Akinis now Richard. So ha cúideach ceall ann gan éméid acin, so thug Emily imirig éidir chéin ha go choch a dtír chois is an éméid an film Gaelic a hacinníos sa station fistraí fearre ar san sin í náheach cinine mu mainine so ha sin uásach ma. Niste, thank you so much. I think it was really, really interesting. One thing that did come into my mind, and I'll just double check the Q&A as well, that we don't have any questions pop up there. And anyone present is welcome to put their mic on now and to ask a question as well. We find that secondary teachers in Gaelic medium education have particular challenges due to the reduced time that they have with pupils. It gets more and more constricted. So what would your key tips be for those teachers? You made mention there towards the end of Gu Katie, for example, and how that can be a useful tool, but perhaps not when they're a wee bit older. What would your top three even suggestions be for secondary teachers?
At the secondary level, I think often issues of organisation and executive function, I suppose, come up, and memory and so on. So I guess supporting students in being as organised as possible with their own classes and homework and timetables and so on. And if the teacher's organised, I think it really helps the students to be organised. And for example, even with often the instructions are quite complicated with assessment practices and so on at the post-primary level or the secondary level. So having sometimes visual multi-step instructions or support for different for kind of more complex tasks and instructions for more complex tasks is good. I do think still that the KT and synthetic voices are still very useful, maybe more useful even at the second level. You're dependent there, I guess, on having the digital textbooks or digital access to digital versions of text or PDF notes of the teacher and so on. But if the teacher can provide PDF or Word documents of notes, then they can use KT to support themselves. In Irish, we have a speech recognition system which works very well for people to do dictation, but as far as I can see, I don't think that's available yet for Gaelic. Am
Not
I
yet.
right there, or
Not
not
yet.
yet?
I don't think we're far away, but not yet.
Yeah, I think maybe Will Lamb might be working on that aspect of
Yeah.
things, possibly in the University of Glasgow or Edinburgh. I'm not too sure. But then let me think of a third top tip off the top of my head.
Well, I think those
Probably.
two are great examples.
Okay.
We've had quite a bit of feedback here, one of which I think we should definitely say from Anne-Marie Beaton, probably the best GME specific training for dyslexia I've ever come across, Tap Life Gomor. So there we go, Emily.
That's really kind.
That's fantastic to
Lauren,
hear.
thank.
And please, if you do have such opinions, put them in your form, Luachi, into the evaluation form. There's a lot of research on phonetics. This is from Tria Cooney. There's a lot of research on phonetics, but there are other ways of helping with are there other ways of helping with literacy, such as the Davis approach? And I've definitely got another question after that as well for you, if you have the time, Emily.
Okay. Yeah, so the phonics side of things. So phonetics then is more just the sounds, and phonics is the links between letters and sounds. So that is one way to go. I do think the multisensory approaches like the Orton Gillingham approach and really focusing on being able to see the word in your mind's eye, having visual scaffolds and so on is really useful. Even, you know, the little spelling letters that you can get, and doing things by using kinesthetic supports, such as those kind of physical letters and so on, can be really useful. On top of that, I think morphological awareness, I know I mentioned it already, but I do think that it really shows promise for Gaelic and Irish. And I would be thinking maybe if you're looking at researching a particular topic for your thesis in that area, or even if you're at doctorate level or whatever it is, I would be really interested in looking at that, or for you to look at that, I guess, and for me to read it.
The
So I think
opportunities are
those things
endless.
are important.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are, and it depends on what stage the child is at really as well. Then in the senior, you're looking beyond the word level strategies, maybe beyond phonological awareness and so on for the older readers.
More than I'll get another question in if I can. How do you respond to professionals who maintain that minority language immersion education has a negative impact on a young person's English literacy skills? I, for one, have heard this for too many times over the years. So I think it's a very, very good question we've got there from Kirsty Lawson. So how would you respond to professionals who maintain that minority language has a negative impact?
I think that, first of all, I'd show them the research base and show them that that is absolutely not the case. It's not what we see in evidence. Minority language education has positive effects, it seems, in the sense that there's no disadvantage to English language reading, and they also have another language in Gaelic or Irish, which gives them an edge in lots of areas of life. And I don't want to go straight to economic areas because I don't think that's what life's about. But even in employment and economics and so on, I think any of the opportunities I've gotten, lots of opportunities I know my friends who speak Irish have gotten, they wouldn't have gotten in the English medium. In the English medium land, really. So it's hugely important in that way, but not only that way, because if a professional wants to boil it down to achievement scores, or for example not having time to do more English language training or support, they need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and look at all of the social, cultural benefits that learning Gaelic or having access to Gaelic and Gaelic poetry, Gaelic reading, Gaelic singing has to offer the child from every aspect of their well-being. A very interesting study as well, and I'll finish up on this. I can see the time is just in, by a friend and colleague of mine, Sinead Nick Andrew, in the Irish context, looking at this question. She found that for students with dyslexia and additional educational needs in the Irish context, really what they were, compared to their friends in English medium context, Gaelic or Irish was like a superpower to them. That was their skill that they were really and that stood them apart from their friends and that they were really interested in. So I think that that if professionals are still of that opinion, I think that they need to be exposed to the research.
I think we've just lost you there, Emily, but I completely agree. I think, and that is a very important point with regards to the aims of the Centre for Teaching Excellence as well, to bridge that gap between practice and research, and that so much we can learn so much more, and evidence like why it is good and why there is not a negative impact. So I think that's a very good point there. We have quite a number of questions. I think we've got one that, and it kind of relates to the previous question. It's with regard to, I'm trying to do some quick translation here, is with regard to parental choice, and sometimes they feel that perhaps moving them from Gaelic to English will be of benefit to them if, you know, dyslexia or a similar problem arises. And again, this is something I have experience of myself. How would you deal with this? What would you say to parents that were experiencing this?
I think that the parent really needs to think about the child's overall well-being, particularly from a social point of view, because I think one of the biggest effects that can have loses their social group who have supported them maybe since they've started school, their friends and their cultural group. So I think that they really need to think about that first of all. Now every parent, of course, is going to make the decision that they think is best for their own child, but also to kind of point out all of the potential benefits of having Gaelic medium education, including those kind of, you know, it being their child's real advantage and real special skill that they have. And then also to point out, there's a researcher, Carmel Nickhart, here in the University of Limerick, who is looking at kind of whether
I think the connection. Oh, we heard University of Limerick.
Am I back? Limerick, that she's looking at student STEM scores who moved from Irish to English medium schools and whether they actually improved. From last time I spoke to her, she hadn't found any evidence that for the students she was working with, that their STEM scores improved when they moved to an English medium school. So that's important for parents to know as well.
That's fascinating.
Yeah,
really interesting. What about, and I might try and finish off with this one because I'm aware of the time, but I think we could have another hour just of chatting about your experience and knowledge and research. But with regard to secondary and primary, if there's not the support in class, if they don't have a PSA, support assistant or similar, what would be the best way of maybe dealing with them or ensuring success? Those moments of success that you highlighted in your Tashbanic there. But how could we facilitate those more easily, do you think?
I lost you there for a second, Gwen. So if the child doesn't have a support system, no, it's just the internet connection, not you personally.
It's Juan. No, just with regards to primary and secondary, very often we find ourselves without any additional support in the classrooms. Whatever the child might, you know, it might not just be dyslexia, but within a framework of dyslexia and supporting a child without an additional adult, how best would you approach that?
So I think that, you know, I'm not sure if universal design for learning has become kind of a big topic in Scotland in education. It's become quite a big topic in Ireland in education, and I think the advantages are meant to be that, you know, it allows for the teacher to plan classes and plan differing, I guess, individualization or differentiation selected by the that doesn't really require additional assistance so much. So I think maybe looking down that line eventually of going towards a universal design for learning and having differing possible tasks that students can select from, where possible, recognizing that, you know, curricular issues are difficult at post-primary levels with assessment scores and so on. But I do think that shows promise for that area, particularly where there's not support from an additional staff member. And yeah, I wonder, just Is the universal design for learning kind of a big topic at the moment there?
I actually had heard of it the first time just recently, and it was at a presentation from somebody at University of Manchester. And it's not something that maybe those that are involved with the curriculum improvement cycle that is ongoing at the moment may have more in-depth knowledge of that. But it was certainly the first time I'd heard it, and that was just a couple of weeks ago. So. But it sounds like differently, as we would say in Gaelic, differentiation, that is a key part of the lesson planning and ensuring success is achievable for all pupils.
Yeah, and having kind of multiple options for them to show their learning is really important. And say, for example, having multiple methods of teaching and allowing students to say look at a video or else read a text and so on. So letting the students decide for themselves what they need and just providing more options up front rather than having to kind of go and help this person and then help that person. And so on. Now that takes time because they found in France when they were looking at, or in Canada, when they were looking at universal design for learning, that like no matter how much they told teachers about it and gave them support, if they didn't give the teachers a chance to actually redesign their lessons and like time to redesign their own curricula and materials, they couldn't do it because they just didn't have you'd be spending hours in your evenings which you just don't have to redesign everything. So that's a big barrier, I think, to universal design for learning, though I think it's really, really promising. So let's see anyway the next 5 or 10 years what comes up there.
Indeed, it's an ever-changing landscape. Modern time, Emily. I think we could easily invite you back for more and talk for a great deal longer. It's been really vital listening, and my mind is now buzzing, and I'm sure everyone else that's still with us as well will be as well. It was terrific. Modern time, and can we ask everyone that's still with us if you could take 10 minutes to fill in that, or less, to fill in that form for our research and evaluation team, being Gomorn or Comain. Agus cúteach na chlárisih son fisan miljoin in na hachertas a ha aking in caun mi bacon of adacher mias fadden be na hession le sarjolige aking iist. So as sin dochas confection tá Shirley and posty voice. Modern tanks, guli sin in pistrich, na kelichen, agus na taspinian, ulich na dilikanation, ulich leave. Good Emila Markov, Emily, modern tank, and we look forward to potentially working with you again, because I think there's just so much to unpack from this thoroughly interesting session. Modern tank.
Thank you.